3 words on Instagram just exposed the Indiana Fever's most painful decision this offseason. Sophie Cunningham posted a throwback video with Caitlin Clark from last season, just the two of them sharing a moment on the court. Nothing dramatic, nothing scripted, just two teammates who clearly had chemistry. And then Caitlin responded, "Time to run it back, that's it." 3 simple words. But with free agency frozen, CBA negotiations stalled, and expansion drafts looming over the entire league, those 3 words just became the Fever front office's worst nightmare. Because here's what nobody's talking about. The Fever might not be able to protect Sophie Cunningham when Portland and Toronto come calling in the expansion draft. And if they lose her, they lose the only player in the entire league who physically defended Caitlin Clark on the court last season. Sophie's response was even more revealing. She joked about cuddling and dinner twice a week, obviously playing around like teammates do. But you know what's not a joke. The fact that this public exchange just put massive pressure on Indiana's front office. Caitlin Clark, the player who drove record attendance and television ratings, the generational talent who saved this franchise, just told everyone she wants Sophie back. And the Fever might have to choose between keeping Sophie happy or protecting other players they consider more valuable. If you believe front offices should listen when their franchise player identifies the teammate she wants to keep, hit that like button right now. It tells us you understand what's really happening here behind the social media banner. Let's cut through the noise for a second, because some comments under that Instagram post were absolutely exhausting. Someone genuinely asked if Caitlin Clark was cheating on her boyfriend Connor because 2 teammates were joking around. This is the circus that follows every Caitlin Clark story. 2 friends engaging in normal, playful banter, and immediately someone tries to manufacture a scandal that has nothing to do with basketball. Caitlin's in a committed relationship with Connor McCaffrey, Sophie's heterosexual. They're friends and former teammates. Can we please focus on the actual basketball crisis unfolding here? Because that crisis is very real. The expansion draft is coming. Portland and Toronto are entering the WNBA. And every existing team has to expose players who can be selected by these new franchises. Most expansion drafts allow teams to protect 5 or 6 players total. That's it. The Fever have 4 absolute locks: Caitlin Clark, Aaliyah Boston, Lexi Hall, and Nelisa Smith. Those 4 are getting protected no matter what, which leaves maybe 1 or 2 protection slots for everyone else on the roster. And here's where this gets complicated. Both Sophie Cunningham and Kelsey Mitchell are unrestricted free agents who've publicly stated they want to return to Indiana. The good news is the Fever should have enough money to resign both of them when free agency finally opens. But if they resign both before the expansion draft, they have to protect both of them. That eats up their remaining protection slots, potentially leaving other valuable players exposed. So what happens if Indiana decides they can't afford to use a protection slot on Sophie Cunningham? What if they calculate that Kelsey Mitchell's 17 points per game matters more than Sophie's off-court star power and physical toughness? Then Sophie's available in the expansion draft, and the moment she's available, Portland or Toronto is selecting her, probably first round, possibly first overall. You want to know why? Sophie Cunningham was the 2nd most searched female athlete in America in 2024. Not 2nd in the WNBA, 2nd among all female athletes in the entire country, according to Google's year-end data. She's got a podcast on the Volume Network with Colin Cowherd. She shows up on major media platforms regularly. She's built a genuine fan base that extends way beyond basketball. And here's the critical part that should terrify the Fever. She accomplished all of that in just 1 season in Indiana. Think about that timeline. 1 year playing alongside Caitlin Clark, and she became the 2nd most searched female athlete in America. That's not just about Sophie's personality or her media presence. That's about the platform that playing next to the league's biggest star provides. She went from being a solid rotation player in Phoenix to a household name in 1 season. That's the Caitlin Clark effect, And now the Fever might lose her because they're worried about protecting other players with better statistics. But statistics don't tell you everything. Go back and watch the tape from last season. Every time Caitlin Clark got knocked down, every time opponents took cheap shots at the league's biggest star, who was the only Fever player consistently stepping up physically? Sophie Cunningham. She was the only teammate who would actually get in someone's face and defend Clark when it mattered. Not just talk about it in post-game interviews, actually do it in the moment, on the court when everyone was watching. The Fever had players with better statistics than Sophie last season. They had players who scored more points and grabbed more rebounds. But they didn't have anyone else who brought that specific willingness to physically protect their franchise player when things got rough. And in a league where Caitlin Clark is going to continue getting targeted by opponents who resent her success and the attention she brings, having someone willing to step up and defend her is incredibly valuable. That element of team culture doesn't show up on a stat sheet. It doesn't factor into advanced metrics or win shares. But it absolutely matters in the locker room and on the court. Caitlin Clark knows it matters. That's why she publicly responded to Sophie's post with time to run it back. She's not just being friendly. She's telling her front office exactly what she values in a teammate. And that brings us to the impossible decision the Fever front office is facing right now. Do they protect Sophie Cunningham, knowing that if they don't, an expansion team will absolutely take her? Or do they protect other players they consider more valuable from a pure basketball standpoint and risk losing the teammate their franchise player specifically asked them to keep? Drop your honest opinion in the comments right now. Should the Indiana Fever protect Sophie Cunningham in the expansion draft, even if it means potentially losing another valuable player? Because this decision is going to define their entire offseason, and there's no clear right answer. Let's talk about Kelsey Mitchell for a second, because she's obviously part of this equation. Mitchell averaged 17 points per game last season and has been the team's most consistent scorer for years. She's the clear priority from a pure basketball standpoint. If you're building a roster based solely on who puts up better numbers, Mitchell is the obvious choice over Cunningham every single time. But here's where this gets complicated. If Indiana can only protect one of their unrestricted free agents in the expansion draft, the basketball decision and the business decision might point in completely different directions. Mitchell is the better player, absolutely no question about that. But Cunningham might actually be the bigger loss if she ends up in Portland or Toronto, because she brings elements that are much harder to replace in free agency or through the draft. She brings legitimate media presence that drives ticket sales and television ratings. She brings fan engagement that extends beyond the basketball court into podcasts and social media. She brings defensive toughness and a willingness to protect the franchise player physically, and she brings chemistry with Caitlin Clark that was obvious to anyone watching last season. Those qualities don't show up in the box score, but they absolutely matter when you're trying to build a contending team around a generational talent. The timeline makes this even more complicated. Free agency can't start until the CBA is finalized, and CBA negotiations are completely stalled right now over revenue sharing and salary cap structure. Nobody knows when that gets resolved. Could be next week, could be next month, could drag on even longer. But whenever it does happen, there's going to be a compressed free agency period followed immediately by expansion draft preparation. The Fever don't have the luxury of waiting to see how the market develops. They can't test the waters and gauge interest levels and negotiate leisurely. They need to make fast decisions about who they're prioritizing and who they're willing to risk losing, and that Instagram exchange between Sophie and Caitlin just forced this conversation into the public sphere, where the front office has to acknowledge what their franchise player wants. Here's another angle that should worry Indiana. What happens if Sophie goes to Portland or Toronto and becomes a legitimate star in her own right? She's 28 years old, entering her prime, with a proven ability to generate media attention and fan engagement. Put her in a featured role on an expansion team that's building an identity from scratch, and she could absolutely break out. Maybe not as a first-team all-WNBA player, maybe not as someone averaging 20 points per game, but as a fan favorite who sells jerseys, drives ticket sales, and brings energy to a new market trying to establish itself. That's incredibly valuable for an expansion franchise that needs recognizable names and personalities to build around. And if the Fever let her walk for nothing, or lose her in the expansion draft because they didn't protect her, that's a missed opportunity that could haunt them for years. Imagine watching Sophie Cunningham become the face of the Portland franchise, doing local radio shows, building a fan base in a new city, and thriving in a larger role. While the Fever are stuck explaining to their fan base and to Caitlin Clark why they chose to protect someone else instead. That's a public relations nightmare that lasts for years, especially when your franchise player publicly asked for that specific teammate to return. The counter-argument is straightforward, though the Fever can't build their roster around sentiment and social media engagement. They need to prioritize winning basketball games. Kelsey Mitchell is objectively the better scorer. Lexi Hull showed real development last season and could be a long-term piece. Nalissa Smith is a former number 2 overall pick with all-star potential. If protecting Sophie means leaving one of those players exposed to the expansion draft, maybe that's not the right basketball move. But here's what's changed in the WNBA over the past year. The line between basketball value and entertainment value is blurrier than it's ever been. The league just negotiated a television deal worth $200 million per year, up from $50 million. That massive increase wasn't driven by competitive balance or playoff drama. It was driven by Caitlin Clark generating record ratings and unprecedented mainstream attention. The league is finally getting paid based on its entertainment value, not just its basketball quality. In that environment, a player like Sophie Cunningham, who brings genuine media presence and fan engagement, has more value than traditional basketball metrics would suggest. She might not be an all-star, but she's someone casual fans actually recognize and want to watch. That matters now in ways it didn't 5 years ago. Let's also talk about what Sophie actually provided last season beyond the box score. The Fever went from a dysfunctional lottery team to a playoff squad. Part of that was Caitlin Clark's arrival. Part of it was Aaliyah Boston's continued development. But part of it was also adding veterans like Cunningham, who understood how to play alongside a ball-dominant guard and didn't need to be the center of attention. She took charges. She hit open threes when defenses collapsed on Clark. She defended physically against bigger players. She brought energy off the bench in moments when the team needed a spark. Those are exactly the qualities you want around a young star who's going to have the ball in her hands most of the time. Sophie didn't need plays called for her. She didn't complain about her role or her minutes. She just did the dirty work that winning teams need from their role players. And now the Fever are staring at a decision that every front office hates, choosing between good options with no clear right answer. They could resign both Mitchell and Cunningham, protect them both, and risk losing someone else valuable in the expansion draft. They could prioritize Mitchell, let Sophie test free agency, and hope she either resigns or doesn't get selected by Portland or Toronto. Or they could make the aggressive move and lock up Sophie specifically because of her off-court value and her chemistry with Clark, even if that means making a difficult decision elsewhere on the roster. What we know for certain is this: Caitlin Clark wants Sophie Cunningham back. She made that clear for everyone to see. The fan base wants Sophie back. Sophie wants to be back. The question is whether the front office values what she brings enough to make it happen. And if they don't, if they let her walk or leave her unprotected and she ends up becoming a fan favorite in Portland or Toronto, they better be right about whoever they chose instead, because that's a mistake that follows them for years, especially when your franchise player publicly asked for that teammate to return and you chose to ignore her. So if you want to see how this expansion draft situation unfolds and whether the Fever actually listen to what Caitlin Clark is telling them, make sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on. Because when these decisions get made, we're breaking down every single move and what it means for Indiana's future. This is the most important offseason in franchise history, and we're covering every angle. See you in the next one.